Invasive throughout Australia, from coastal towns to the outback country, found at railway sidings and abandoned farms and open plains and country roadsides, a long-lived, hardy evergreen drought-tolerant tree with large trusses of rosy-coloured berries that exude an aromatic, penetrating, unpleasant oil that clings to the hands after any part of the tree is handled. A native of Peru, introduced into Australia, the peppercorn tree is a tree of mystery. Another tree of mystery was cabinet maker Francis Edison, originally from York in England. From the shadows of a dim moonlight night, he surprised single servant Anne Sanders on a highway with a large knife clasped in his hand, threatening your money or your life, or he would kill her if she failed to comply with his demand. Francis Edison, aged 20, was apprehended and convicted of highway robbery at the Old Bailey in 1826 and sentenced to death, but subsequently commuted to life with 7 years servitude and transported to Hobart Penal Settlement in Van Diemen's Land, arriving there 1827 with 189 other convicts on the convict ship Governor Ready. He was later employed by the governor as a cabinet maker in Hobart Town. Elizabeth Morgan, originally from Gloucestershire in England, was found guilty of robbing her mistress in 1826 and was sentenced to 14 years at Van Diemen's Land, arriving there in 1829. After receiving permission, Francis Edison and Elizabeth Morgan were married by the penal chaplain, Reverend William Bedford, of St. David's Church in Murray Street, Hobart. Their first child, born in 1833, died at 5 weeks. They had several more children, Elisa, Joseph, William and Francis, all born in Hobart Town. Francis and Elizabeth were later pardoned, and Francis worked as a carpenter in Hobart. On application, Francis in 1842 became the licensee of King's Arms Hotel and later, in 1844, the Bluebells of Scotland in Murray Street, Hobart. But the businesses failed and Francis petitioned for bankruptcy in 1844. Soon after, the Edisons, with their family, moved to Victoria on mainland Australia, then migrated to the Bendigo diggings in central Victoria, 135 kilometres northwest of Melbourne, where Francis held a miner's right at Loddon, eventually moving to Maldon, eager to make their fortune at the Tarrangower goldfields after the discovery of alluvial gold at the base of the slopes of Mount Tarrangower in 1853. The Chief Commissioner for Goldfields reported over 3,000 miners had arrived at the diggings just 1 month after the first discovery of gold there. Elizabeth had a store at Sandy Creek near Maldon at the intersection of Sears Lane and Newstead Road, providing goods and services to travellers and miners in the Maldon district. Francis died aged 51 after a short illness at Tarrangower in 1856. His death was reported by his son Joseph to the registrar in Maldon. However, no records of his burial site have been found. Elizabeth remained a widow and moved to Bendigo, where she lived until her death in 1872, aged 68, following 5 months of poor health. She was buried in an unmarked grave located in the Pioneer section of Eaglehawk Cemetery near Bendigo, Victoria. Joseph, their eldest son, a bootmaker, married Eleanor Petchy, a midwife nurse, at Broken Hill, New South Wales, in 1895. Eleanor, a midwife, frequently advertised her services in the Barrier Minor from their Argent Street home in Broken Hill. Harold Burt Edison, 24, a son of Joseph and Eleanor, married 22-year-old Comfort Renfrey at his parents' Argent Street home in 1901 at North Broken Hill. Comfort Renfrey was born in the historical town of Peninsular, 388 kilometres southeast of Adelaide. Their first child, Harold Jr., died stillborn at Broken Hill in 1905. They later had 3 daughters, Elizabeth Helena May, born New South Wales, Elsie Jean, born at Gawler in South Australia, and Pearl Joyce, born at Meningie in Adelaide. Harold's father, Joseph, was buried at Broken Hill Cemetery near his grandson, Harold Jr. Eleanor and her son Joseph William later moved to the suburb of Leederville in Perth, Western Australia, until her death in 1913. Following the proclamation of South Australia, Thomas Slater, with his pregnant wife Lucy and their 3 young daughters aged 7, 5 and 2, left London as free migrant passengers on the 3-masted wooden ship Winchester for the colony of South Australia. After much suffering and misfortune, Lucy's child was stillborn 20 days before arriving at Port Adelaide in September 1838. They settled at the Reeds Beds west of Adelaide, where Thomas worked as a farmer. They had 4 more children. Their first son, born 1840, known as William, was christened John William Slater at Trinity Church in Adelaide. Ellen Roebuck travelled alone from England to South Australia on the ship Stamboul, arriving in Adelaide in 1858, married John William Slater in 1863 at the Adelaide residence of Anne and Joseph Juck. They moved to Melbourne and had several children. Eventually returning to Adelaide, where Ellen commenced business, going around the streets of Adelaide with her cart, buying second-hand goods for minimal money and reselling them in her shop. At age 52 years, William deserted Ellen, leaving her and their children with no means of support, and William was later found on his premises at Rundle Street in Adelaide, having attempted suicide with a small gun and a bullet to the back of the head that was later removed at the Adelaide Hospital. With her sons Joseph, Charles and Alfred, Ellen managed to keep the second-hand furniture business operating, and the business grew, with her daughter Mary Jane Slater following into the furniture business. Mary Jane Slater married Francis William Bailey, one of 9 children of William Thomas, a blacksmith, and Ellen Bailey, who had emigrated from England on the ship Mary Green, disembarking at Port Adelaide in 1856. Francis and Mary Slater Bailey's first child, Francis William, born on the 4th of June 1905, died several months later. A second child, a daughter, Ellen Roebuck, born October 1893, died in 1894. They had more children, daughters Eva Myrtle, Vera Charlotte, and sons Charles Arthur, who died less than 12 months old. then Alfred Thomas, George Frederick, and William, who died at 4 months, and then Leslie and Charles Arthur Slater Bailey. On one of the many journeys with my mother, travelling on Johnson's coaches on Glen Osmond Road to Aldgate, where we lived, a small historical village located in the Mount Lofty Ranges, 20 kilometres. She pointed out the home where her auntie and uncle and herself lived at Glenunga, and the Glen Osmond Primary School she attended nearby. That was my introduction to her family after the loss of our first child, Michelle Inica, who died 3 months old. In July 1971, I made some inquiries at the Lands and Title Department in Adelaide, searching for a property my mother had said Mary Jane Slater Bailey had once owned. The small pieces of information that my mother did share were helpful when in 2013, on impulse, ventured into the Adelaide Central Market Arcade, inquiring about Mary Jane Slater Bailey, and they directed me to the Adelaide City Council archives, and there discovered records of lease documents in Mary Jane Slater Bailey's name for premises at the Central Market Arcade from 1915 to 1936, and had 9 shops plus a large room within the Adelaide complex where she traded as Bailey's Central Stores. At the State Library Family Research Centre, searching on Trove, a website of the National Library of Australian digitised newspapers, there was an article in the Adelaide Advertiser about Mary Shirley.
Then in September last year, I received an email inquiry from John, and he was asking about my connection to the Baileys and the Haymans and the Slaters. And from then on, it was a mighty journey, obtaining documents and one thing and another, and the story of his mother, Mary Shirley. Having been born in Adelaide and growing up with the Baileys, in particular Vera, my grandmother, Eva and Uncle Alf, we had a very close association with those members of the Bailey family. We always talked about family stories, family histories, so I knew them very well. We left Adelaide when I was 10 years old. We used to come back to Adelaide every year, stay with my nana. Oh, sorry, I'm getting emotional. And spend lots of time with the aunties and uncles. Wonderful, wonderful memories. We knew about Grandma Bailey and her shop, but until recently I just didn't know the full extent of her businesses. My husband and I went to Adelaide in May last year. I organised a family reunion of the Slaters, Greg Slater, Chris Code, who's a Slater descendant, and other Slater families. And it was here I discovered a lot more about my great-grandmother Mary Jane. And since then, it has been an incredible journey.
My first memories of the Baileys was George. Mum lived in Chaffer Street, and she actually lived with my great-grandma, Easter, and who died in Chaffer Street. And that's where George first came into the picture. I assumed that he was my father, and he acted like a father. I can remember. Anyway, from Chaffer Street, the next thing I remember is going out to what we called our home, and that was the home out at King William Road, Parkside. And it was out there that I become a member of the Bailey family, and living in the great old mansion out there was Grandpa Bailey, Grandma Bailey, and a young girl slightly older than I, and who I remember her very distinctly because we used to play together. Grandma Bailey was a cripple, and she was always in the wheelchair. I never ever seen her out of the wheelchair. Of a morning, I used to have to go down the driveway. She had the strawberry patches running right down the driveway, and I used to have to go down and pick a punnet of strawberries for her so she could take to to the shop in town in the Adelaide market in Victoria Square. She doted on me. Oh, she used to really dote on me. And Mary, of course. Grandma Bailey had the massive big shop in the Adelaide Arcade. She had almost a full block of shops there, and the whole family used to go in there on a Friday night. I think it was Friday night because of Friday night shopping in them days. All the family, all the boys, with the exception, I don't think I ever seen Frank in the shop. I know Alf and Les and George, Mum, and the two girls used to go in there, and I think even the girls' husbands. I can't ever remember seeing Mary in their shop. I used to go in there. I used to play out in the market area while they were in the shop. I think they used to go till about 10 o'clock at night. Grandma Bailey was a very wealthy woman. She had a very big reputation. She also prestige. She was the whole family had maybe a bit better imagination of themselves than what they were, or the position they took in society. So her job, she'd leave of a morning around about 8:30. She'd be driven by a chauffeur. She'd go in there. She used to sit up in the back in her wheelchair, which they used to roll up from the back. She'd sit in the wheelchair, and she looked all like the image of the Queen Victoria, dressed in black. She was always dressed in black. She had jewellery on every finger. I can always remember that she had big swollen fingers, and there was rows of diamond rings. She had necklaces on and everything. Sitting up in her big, what I call gangster car, no hood, but it was specially adapted for her. Grandma Bailey had at the back of the old home, there was another area where she had a two-storey workshop storeroom. These young girls used to work there, and the story was that Grandpa Bailey was a bit of a roamer, and he used to stay home of the daytime. He actually got one of the young girls pregnant. I believe there's no birth certificate of Mary, and I believe that the reason that be is that the birth was covered up by the Bailey family.
The family always knew that the father was Frank Bailey.
That was confirmed by Mum and Uncle Alf, amongst other things. Mary was always appeared to me as a child and been a happy-go-lucky sort of child. Had no problems, no sort of problems, with the exception was that she was, I think, very highly strung girl. I went to school in the Unley Infant School, used to walk to school, but I never even remember Mary ever going to school. All the Baileys were well educated. Like I say, the boys went to Christian Brothers, all outlaws, all roamed had a reputation for being quite larrikins because of their mother's wealth. She was a very wealthy woman.
On the 14th of July 1936, Mary Jane Slater Bailey was admitted to the Adelaide Hospital, where she died shortly after admission from complications caused by an ulcer, cellulitis of the leg and toxemia. Mary Jane was buried on the 16th of July 1936 at West Terrace Cemetery in Adelaide.
The oldest son got the grandfather, and they locked him in the library there, and they went through all the documents. The thing was that they were searching for the will and all the relevant documents. When they come out at 4 or 5 o'clock at night, they announced that there was no will. They couldn't find a will, so she died intestate. And so they'd gone through the safe, the big safe there, and that there was no money or no jewellery or anything. That had all disappeared.
Her widowed husband, Francis, directed his sights to the Supreme Court of South Australia and made an application for letters of administration to Mary Jane's estate. The two daughters, Eva and Vera, became estranged with their father, believing that their mother did leave a will and last testament. At the State Library Family Research Centre, searching on Trove, a website of the National Library of Australian digitised newspapers, there was an article in the Adelaide Advertiser about Mary Shirley. On discovery of public trustee records for Mary Jane Slater Bailey's estate, documents revealed that Elsie Jean Edison, a daughter of Harold and Comfort Edison, had given birth to a baby girl, Mary Shirley Edison, born on the 7th of February 1927 at Nurse Ray's maternity home, South Terrace, Adelaide. The documents also suggest that Mary Shirley may have been adopted. Following the exchange of emails and phone calls, I travelled to Canberra to meet Wayne Jones, who could provide more information about Comfort and Harold.
Harold was my mother's father. I basically became interested in Harold because of when my mother was about to die, and I asked her what she knew about her father, and she basically didn't know a great deal. So in effect, the searching was left to me at the time, and she gave me a name of Harold Edison, although she was raised under the name of Wade. I decided to look at it a bit more closely, a bit more in depth, and searched, went to the National Archives website, and luckily enough, Harold's war records was one of the first OIF members to have his records digitised. Looking at his records, I saw a name of another woman, Harold's wife, Comfort. So Comfort became a mystery, and from that moment on, I wanted to know more about her and find out about where Comfort come from and what happened to her. It was really difficult to find details because of where she lived and with Harold and what happened after Harold left Comfort, and reasons why. Never knew what happened, why it happened. So it was all a mystery. So I just thought, let's just gather some information and write it up in a small homepage, webpage type of thing. And I was looking at old microfiche records of electoral rolls, and I was tracing up Harold and his new partner, more or less, who was my mother's mother, and found out that she was married, and then eventually through the National Library with their trove digitised newspapers online, I found her divorce article, and that Harold was actually mentioned in that article, and also Comfort was mentioned in that article. The family knew about it somewhere or another, but all that information was never passed down the years to kids and grandchildren, so they sort of hushed it up a bit. She left the husband and brought two of the daughters from that marriage, the relationship with Harold. And I knew them as Auntie Clan and Auntie Helen. They were older children in the family at the time. And I traced them through the electoral rolls from Harrow to Ballarat, Ararat, Ballarat, and around various addresses in Ballarat. And throughout these moves, I think they changed their surname about 3 or 4 times. So from Edison to Wade, Wade to Edison, and back again to Wade. So it was a question, obviously, why was this happening? And at the same time, I thought, why not I look for Comfort and see if I can find where Comfort may be. So I found her also in the electoral roll, but I couldn't find anything else about her. So she was pretty difficult to track down. So my mother always thought that she wasn't of convict stock, and which was pretty funny because my father's side of the family were very much guests of the government back in the 19th century, which was quite quite unique in the family, I suppose, because there was quite a few of them made the way out here under chains. But my mother always denied having any sort of convict history. And she always believed that also her father was Scottish of some kind. She showed me a photo of him in a kilt. I did a sort of a search on his military history a bit more, traced where he went to and that kind of thing. And then somehow or another I got in contact or met Alice. And so Alice became a focus. One of the questions I always had was why Harold changed his name from Edison to Wade and where that come from. Now, I must admit that I first had the inkling that Harold was picked up the name Wade from a man or a fellow soldier in his unit in World War I, whose name was Wade, and he didn't make it back to Australia. In Harrow, where himself and Alice spent time, Harrow in Victoria, the Wade family is quite prominent in that part of the world. So maybe he got it there, or maybe the Harold or the Wade that he changed his name from came from Harrow. I don't know.
In Melbourne, Victoria, I met Wayne's cousin Cheryl, a granddaughter of Harold and Alice, and also Cheryl's cousin, Kathy Paris.
Since Wayne started doing all the research and coming to me for some information, he's got my curiosity going, and now I've learned that we've got family that Harold had before we were Harold's family. It's tested my curiosity somewhat to have a look and see who's who and where everybody got to, and you know, the fact that we've got other family, that it's amazing, absolutely amazing. I've seen the Edison family tree, and according to that, we are the lost family. Along with the two daughters that Alice brought with her, Harold and Alice went on to have 5 more girls and a boy, so they were a family of 8 in total. The oldest girl, her name was Kathleen, and that was Alice's daughter to her first husband. Kathleen had 5 children, 4 boys and 1 girl. 3 of those are still living today. The second daughter, Helen, who came with Alice as well. Helen had 3 boys and 2 girls, and there are 2 girls and 2 boys of those living today. The firstborn to Harold and Alice was a lady named Thora, or a baby named Thora, and Thora was deaf. Thora in later life did marry, and she had 2 girls and 1 boy. Then the next one born was a boy called Harry, and he was Harry, not Harold. He was definitely Harry. Harry married, and for some time they didn't have any children, but eventually they did have a son. The next born was a set of twins. Their names were Doreen and Joan. Now, Joan died at the age of 21 with gallstones. She left behind 2 little girls, and their names were Catherine and Doreen. Catherine was adopted by Harry, and Doreen went to live with Joan's husband's family. The next children born were another set of twins named Nancy and Edna. Nancy married and had 2 children, and Edna, who was my mother, married and had 2 daughters. None of Harold's children live to this day. They are all gone. My mother was the last to go, who died 2 years ago. We have no evidence that Harold and Alice ever married, and we don't believe that they ever did. We certainly believe that neither Harold and Alice were married to each other. They are buried together, and Harold had a tombstone on his grave and the name Edison was never mentioned. Then Alice died 9 years after, and Alice's name was never added to the plaque, and she just got a little brass thing put down the bottom of the grave. Since my mother passed 2 years ago, who is Harold's youngest daughter, I knew that my mother was always upset about Alice's name not being added to the tombstone, so I made some inquiries to find out if we could have that fixed. And after some running around, I managed to get authority to do that. And apparently there's no one else in the family seems to know where Harold and Alice are buried, and I don't know why that is, but nobody goes there and it's just been left. Now it's all being restored.
Harry Wade was my birth mother's brother. So I was adopted by an uncle and aunt after my birth mother, Joan, died. She died at the age of 21. I was 3 months old. I have a sister who's 18 months older than me. Her name is Doreen. She was brought up by the paternal grandparents. So our natural father is Eric Wilson. So she was brought up by his parents and eventually adopted by them in Ballarat. I was adopted by an uncle and aunt, obviously. They brought me to Melbourne. So the sisters were separated. I was taken to Ballarat often for visits, to visit the Wades, but not the Wilsons. I remember sitting on my grandmother's knee. I've got a picture at home. Well, I think I might have been about 3 or 4, sitting on her knee. I was 4 years old when I was finally adopted because there was an objection on the part of my natural father, Eric Wilson. He didn't want to sign the adoption papers. Now, he'd been in trouble with the law over the years too, petty thief. He was also away in the army. So my sister tells me that she grew up believing he was her big brother. She rummaged through his room and found some sort of evidence to say that he was her father. So she confronted him at the tender age of about 12, confronted him and said, "I know you're my father, not my brother. Where's my sister? Where's my twin sister?" So he then, I don't think he did give much information at that stage, but apparently at the age of 12, she and a girlfriend from school ran away to Geelong, hopped on the train in their school uniform, wearing lipstick, cigarette hanging out of their mouths, on a train to Geelong. She was looking for this so-called twin sister. When they disembarked from the train in Geelong, they were picked up by the police and promptly brought home. She had no idea whereabouts to look in Geelong, of course. So that was the end of that little adventure. My sister was a bit of a tomboy. She tells me she had a wonderful life because she was outdoors all the time and didn't stay at home. She was out for 10 hours of the day and used to go home for dinner. But at the age of 15, when I was 15, my adopted parents had separated at that stage, so they were going through some emotional turmoil. And I was living with my mother in a flat, my adopted mother, and I came home, I'd started work at the age of, actually I was just on 16, that was my first job. I came home from work one night, she was terribly upset. And I wanted to know why, and she said, "Oh, don't ask me, don't ask me." I said, "But Mum, you know, something's wrong, something's wrong." "Oh, 2 men were here, came down from Ballarat looking for you." Well, and I wanted to know why, naturally. I knew that I had relatives in Ballarat. We used to visit on a fairly regular basis. But of course, then I was worried at that age. That incident that Mum had said, whereby 2 men had come from Ballarat, it wasn't 2 men, it turned out to be my sister. She was nearly 17 at the time. She had badgered relatives in Ballarat for information about me and where I was living. She found Harry Wade. He was a pastry cook. He had his own business in Thomastown in Victoria. And she came down to Melbourne, 17 years old, got off the train, got a taxi. This is her story, and I believe her. She said, "I told the taxi driver I'm down in Melbourne looking for my sister. I'm not sure where to start, but I'm looking for her father, Harry Wade. He's got a cake shop somewhere. I think it's the northern suburbs, Thomastown." The taxi driver turned off the meter and took her around for hours. Dropped her, stopped at the shop. They found the shop. She walked in, and as soon as Dad saw her, he knew who she was, and she knew him. And she said, "I just want to see Kathy. I want to see Kathy." And he said, "Oh, look, now's not a good time. Norma, his wife, and I've been, we're separated. Norma's in a real state. She's not going to let you near Kathy. But I'll give you her, I'll let her know, and if you give me an address, I'll get her to get in touch with you." So they did correspond. They sent my adopted mother and Doreen did send a couple of letters to each other, and in one of them in which Doreen begged to be able to just come and look at me from afar, not to approach me, but anyway, my mother refused. So it was 4 years later, I was engaged to be married. That caused a bit of a rupture in the family. My adopted parents were against the marriage. I found out about the adoption in a rather nasty fashion. I was told that if I wanted to find my real father, I'm being very honest here, I could go find him rotting in the jail in Ballarat. First hint I had that they were not my real parents. I had been given a photograph of Eric Wilson and Joan Wade, my mother, after I'd found out. So it was a wedding photograph. So at my sister's wedding, I was looking around the church to see if I could recognise my natural father, Eric. I did spot him. Anyway, after the ceremony, we came out to the foyer, and at that stage he had a de facto wife, came up to me in front of all these people and made a huge fuss, and I retreated. I took an instant dislike to him. I was overwhelmed with it all. Only a couple of years ago, when Eric died, I did go up to Ballarat to be with my sister after Eric died, and I was at the funeral, and I met 4 of my siblings, and I had never met before, and we're all in our 50s at that stage. So it's really, I think I said to you, John, that I sometimes feel a little bit disconnected.
Investigations of State Ward documents revealed intimate information about Mary Shirley, who also was disconnected and felt she belonged nowhere. Mary and her mother, Elsie Jean, had been living at the Slater Bailey home when Elsie consented for her daughter to be adopted by William Francis and Mary Jane Slater Bailey. On the 1st of April 1927, Elsie's daughter was adopted by court order and renamed Mary Shirley Slater Bailey. Shortly after her adopted mother, Mary Jane, died, her adopted father, Francis, felt he could not take care of 9-year-old Mary Shirley.
And the story told to me by Eva's son, Darryl, Eva, one of the Bailey family children that didn't have children, she was forced to adopt Mary by the sons or son.
And Mary was adopted by her uncle and auntie, Walter Vine and Eva Hayman. Walter Vine Hayman, known as Wally, one of 4 brothers born at the railway town of Quorn, northern South Australia, to Ernest Vine and Matilda Hayman. With his father Ernest Hayman and brothers Roy, Charles and Percy, he worked for the South Australian Railways at Quorn. Walter was eventually promoted to the Traffic Control Branch as an officer at the Adelaide Railway Station, where he was highly regarded. Walter Vine Hayman and Eva Bailey married at St Peter's Anglican Church, Glenunga, South Australia in 1923. They did not have any children until 2 years after they had adopted Mary, and then had a son they named Darryl. There was considerable friction and bickering in the home. Eva Hayman callously told Mary when she was about 14 years old the truth of her parents and nature of her birth, and Mary found it difficult.
Mary had a rather rough time. I've seen evidence of that she left home after arguments with Vera.
She ran away from home at age 15 in February 1942, and Wally reported her to police as a missing person. She was found by police several days later and was arrested, charged with larceny and sentenced to 2 years as an uncontrollable child to Barton Vale's Girls' School at Enfield until 18. After 6 months' detention at Barton Vale, she was placed on probation to her father, Walter Hayman, after he had made an application for her to be returned to their Glenunga home. She continued to study at Adelaide High School, although the relations with her adoptive parents were still somewhat strained. Mary worked at Escort House in September 1943 in the Adelaide suburb of Grange before being transferred in November to the River Murray town of Berry, where she worked at Berry Hospital as a probationary nurse. She enjoyed the friendly country community and the ready acceptance of her. Mary liked to go out late at night with her friends, and after being warned several times by the matron for remaining out late for several nights in succession, before she dismissed her in early April 1944 for not conforming to the hospital regulations. Shortly after her dismissal, Mary appeared in the Berry Police Court charged with unlawful possession and sentenced for 2 years, returned to Barton Vale Girls' School. Mary was later placed out on probation to Mrs. Brown and her young family at Belair near the Adelaide Hills in February 1945. 4 months after her arrival, she overheard a conversation between Mrs. Brown's brother and their doctor, and Mary believed she was too much of a responsibility for them, and left the Browns, returning to Barton Vale Girls' School. Mary was further placed on probation to the matron of Lady Victoria Buxton Girls' Club in Whitmore Square in Adelaide, where she lived with other girls and worked at a department store in the city. On the morning of Sunday 18th November 1945, Mary left Lady Buxton Girls' Club shortly after breakfast and did not return until later that evening. She told matron she had been to Mount Lofty in the Adelaide Hills by herself and met Leslie Bailey, who admitted to her that he was her father. He told her that her mother had left her a sum of money in her will. The revelation about her father seemed to upset her, and she told him that she did not want to see him again, and developed a desire to manage her own affairs. Mary absconded from Lady Buxton's Girls' Club on the morning of 26th November 1945 and was arrested 3 days later, charged with false pretences and placed on a 12-month bond and returned to Barton Vale Girls' School for psychological treatment. In an interview, Mary's adopted father, Wally Hayman, was asked if they had any plans for Mary on her release from Barton Vale. He thought it better that Mary have no contact with his home whatever. On her release from the Welfare Department, 21st of March 1946, Mary was placed at Burra, a small, rural and former copper mining town in mid-north South Australia, 162 kilometres from Adelaide, with Mrs. Emily Tiver of Alberton Park, Burra North. In June, several months after arriving at Burra, Mary left Mrs. Tiver, returning to Adelaide.
The story was that she'd run away with a soldier and hadn't been seen or heard of since.
She met a returned soldier, Alan Glasson, and became pregnant with his child, who she married on December the 6th, 1946. For reasons unknown, Mary left the marriage several weeks later and formed a new relationship with Kingsley Harold King, who was working as a chef at the Commercial Travellers Club North Terrace in Adelaide, who she married on the 24th of November 1947 at the Registry Office in Flinders Street, Adelaide, while still being married to her husband, a bricklayer, Alan Glasson, who instituted proceedings for a divorce about a month after his marriage to Mary on the grounds of adultery with Kingsley, and was granted an order in the Supreme Court of South Australia for a decree nisi on the 21st of April 1947 that became absolute 6 months later. Mary appeared in the Adelaide Police Court charged with having committed bigamy on the 19th of November 1947 and was committed for trial to appear at the Supreme Court in Adelaide on the 24th of November 1948. Mary was released on 3 years good behaviour bond on the 9th of December 1948. After legally marrying Kingsley, who had a daughter, Barbara Kay, born in June 1943, from a previous relationship with a married woman, Constance Donovan, moved to Manor Hill in outback northeast South Australia, 360 kilometres northeast of Adelaide, where he worked on various sheep stations as a fencing contractor before returning to Adelaide. The marriage was not harmonious. Mary experienced many years of domestic violence by Kingsley, who had a violent temper. One night in 1964, after a domestic argument, Mary was locked out of the family home and her children were unable to escape from the house. The women police intervened and the children removed and placed into the control of the Children's Welfare Department. Several children were placed out with foster parents. Mary left and went to Melbourne, Victoria, unaware that she was expecting another child, but eventually returned to Kingsley several months later. The marriage had failed by 1966. Their last child was relinquished by Mary Shirley for adoption as she could not provide for him.
Since having a lot of conversation and contact with John, We've learnt the rather mixed and sad life that Mary Shirley led, and sort of analysed the personalities of the two sisters who were probably the most involved. And Eva was rather a hard lady and would have had high expectations, and perhaps a rebellious young teenager didn't suit in her thoughts of what a young girl should be. My own nana, which is Vera, she was also pretty prim and proper. The girls were given a very good education, and I think they thought they were better than some others in society. My nana, I was telling John the story, she always dressed for dinner, put on the twin set and the skirt and the beads, a little bit of lippy and makeup, and she said to me that this is something you should always do, dress for dinner and look clean and tidy and have the house presentable for your husband.
On rare occasions, my mother would provide small pieces of information about family connections. She once commented that the notorious 1920s Melbourne underworld gangster, Squizzy Taylor's wife, was her auntie, and his daughter Lillian Taylor married Frank Bailey, my mother's uncle.
That was pretty obvious because that was told to me by Alf. He said that his wife was a family, that she was the daughter of Squizzy, and that Squizzy had organised it for someone else to be named the father. That's why his name never appeared on the birth certificate.
Aunt Lillian did not have a very good opinion of Mary, and definitely did not want Mary to visit her home, as she feared Mary's influence on her children. Mary enjoyed dancing, and her uncle, Aubrey Eugene Hall, a champion ballroom dancer and one of Adelaide's foremost dance promoters, who held many dances at the Palais and Wonderland ballrooms, and one of the most prominent dance teachers in Adelaide, starting at age 21, who taught dancing for nearly 50 years, married Harold and Comfort Edison's eldest daughter, Elizabeth Helena May, professional dancer, but the marriage dissolved in divorce in 1930. There were no children to the relationship. Aubrey Hall remarried and had several children, and one of his children, daughter Vivian Cox, was located in Adelaide in 2015.
My name, as you said, is Vivian Cox, and I was, or still am, I suppose, the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Aubrey Hall, who were the dance icons of Adelaide. And my dad died in 1970 at about the age of 72, and he, amongst many other things, from being a dancing teacher, was also a boxer. I'm a champion runner for the Adelaide Harriers, and through your information, I believe, a carpenter to begin with. And he had, prior to marrying my mum, had a previous marriage to one of your relatives, who I've just learnt some information about, but no children. So he married my mum in the close to 1940s, I think, and had some children with mum, which was my brother Grantley and my brother Marcus, and then I became adopted in 1960 to this family. So my oldest brother Grant is 10 years older, my brother Marcus was 5 years older, and then I came along at around about the age of 8 months to 1 year. So my adoption at the time was not under normal process. My biological mother Pamela fell pregnant when she was about 15, had me when she was about 16, and couldn't remain at home, so she did marry my father, and that lasted for about 3 months. So then she needed somewhere to go, advertised me in a miscellaneous column for foster parents or someone that would take on a housekeeper and a child, and a reporter picked it up in those days and knew of my family, the Aubrey Halls, who had also written in a letter asking to be considered for fostering, and he picked it up and knew the family very well and suggested that my mother consider looking at this family, which she did, and Mum and Dad said they wanted to adopt, not to foster, and therefore the process started. Mum and Pamela remained in contact for quite a few years. Pamela lived not very far from where I grew up. She wanted to keep an eye on me from a distance. Turns out our siblings crossed paths over the years as well, and without us knowing. And so I was about 18 when Mum decided that I could meet her, and lo and behold I did, and was very fortunate enough to actually get along with the family and to get to know them very well. And I consider I was very fortunate because I had no regrets over my adoption. I grew up with a wonderful family, so I was considered to be one of the lucky ones. And unfortunately, my mother Pamela, though, did carry quite a cross of guilt for having to hand her child over under those circumstances, and could never understand why I didn't have any ill feeling towards her. Instead, I was actually quite grateful of the life that I'd had, and I had great admiration for her for the strength and courage that it would have taken to have handed over a child at that age. In fact, even when I had my own kids, I remember holding them at that age in my arms, and whilst they were asleep and looking down at them and thinking, oh my God, what courage it would have taken to have given your child away at that age. But she could never understand that, so she carried a lot of grief and guilt with her. But we were fortunate we got along. It filled a lot of things in my life which I didn't even realise what connections I had been missing, but then was able to put all the puzzle together, and I suppose to a certain degree felt quite whole once I sort of got my family history and see what I could get from her. I only knew that Dad was married prior. I didn't have any details on who he was married to, whether there was any children, how long they were married for. Had an inkling that she was a dancer, but didn't know any more than that. So I haven't got any knowledge or photographs or anything. I was just made aware that Dad was married prior and that Mum was his second marriage, and that he was a fair bit older than Mum. And I think we worked it out, he was about 17 years older than Mum, because he was a boxer as well, which would explain why he was so light on his feet for dancing, and vice versa. But he took a lot of events to Melbourne, both in the boxing field and the dancing field, and both he and Mum travelled around Australia judging a lot of events in the championships for dancing as well. But I'm assuming that all the dancing they did for around in all the ballrooms would have started with who we know as Maisie, his first wife, and then would have carried on with Mum when she came onto the scene. As I said to you earlier, I was told at the age of 10 after Dad died, because he didn't want me to know. And it seemed a natural thing that Mum was telling me. It made sense what she was saying, and I was accepting of it. And I think part of it was because she told me the full story, and there was no lies, no hidden truths. And I sort of, understood it, to realise what I had got, what I'd inherited from my upbringing, and then to realise there was a gap of what came to me naturally, even though Mum and I were very, very much alike. So when I did meet Pamela, my biological mother, there was just this instant connection and this instant, I know what I get now from my birth mother, I know what I get from my family, what my inheritance is there. I said I was fortunate. I've met others over the years who have been adopted, and they haven't had such good fortunes as I have. They've held a lot of resentment, a lot of asking why, how could they do this to me? I never had that, because it was explained to me from the word go. And that's where Pamela did carry that cross, and she carried it from the time that she gave me up. And for her it was very hard. She wouldn't accept the fact that I had no grudges with her, nothing against her for what she had done. She found that very hard to deal with, and carried that with her until she died. And your mum's story was more common, far more common. Through those early days, right through to quite recent times, really. And even in today's society, so much is still hidden. A lot of people are still, ashamed or embarrassed as to what's either happened all those donkeys years ago or what's even happening now. But to me, it's all about, you've got to find out who you are, what your heritage is.
Investigations continued in searching for Elsie Jean, and then in December 2015, a relative of Elsie was located in Perth, Western Australia.
I was born here in York, in what is now the Residency Museum. Originally it was the resident magistrate's house, but just prior to the war it was scheduled to be bulldozed, and one of my favourite people, Esme Marwick, chained herself to the building and prevented the bulldozing. During the war it became a maternity wing of the York Hospital, and most of the babies of my vintage, a few years earlier, a few years later, were all born there in what is now the York Museum. The first house I ever lived in was this house, and just a room just around from the kitchen there. In those days, my mother and father, they were on a Coolgardie mine site. The name of the mine was Spargo's Reward. And my father worked with two of his brothers, Jim Marwick and Boy Marwick, whose real name was Francis. In 1937, my dad married my mother in a civil ceremony in Kalgoorlie, and before long they were at Spargo's Reward. My mother kicked up a lot of fuss about just how primitive it was, because she was living in a tent and things were not all that flash, so she put on a bit of a tantrum, and it worked pretty well because all the miners down tools on one weekend, and they made her a makeshift house. It was probably 2 rooms, a kitchen and a bedroom, and she was pretty happy after that. But when she fell pregnant with me, there was certainly no place for a pregnant woman out virtually in the middle of the West Australian desert. Very dry, very dusty, not a good place at all. Too far, too remote from doctors or any medical assistance. So my mother was taken to York, where she could stay with some of my father's siblings. For the first few months of my life, we stayed in this house, and then when I was a little older, it was time to move back to the goldfields, and my mother then fell pregnant again, and she had another baby in Kalgoorlie. However, that baby did not survive, just a few hours or 5 days, something like that. Seems to be a bit of a toss-up whether the baby lived 5 hours or 5 days. But anyway, the baby did not survive, and my mother didn't have any other children. And to the best of my knowledge, throughout my life until just a few short weeks ago, I thought that lost baby brother of mine was all the siblings, if you like, that I would have ever had. Same year I was born, World War II started. Wasn't too long and my dad had joined up in the army and went overseas on active service. He ended up escaping in Crete, virtually stealing a rowing boat and being picked up at sea by a British destroyer, and eventually he was brought back to Australia. It was not in very good condition by that time. And meanwhile, my mother had shifted to Fremantle, and when my father rejoined my mother, he got a job on the wharf at Fremantle. I can't say they had a particularly happy marriage, because by the time I was about 4 or 5, the marriage fallen away, and my father had gone back to the bush, and my mother had begun working again as a barmaid. And I spent the next few years in a variety of foster homes, some good, some not so good. By the time I was about 14 and a half, nearly 15, I came to live with my mother again, and by this time she was married to a really nice guy called Ernie Poland. He'd been an airman during the Second World War. Good fellow, very, very kind to my mother, very generous to my mother. And certainly very good for me. So by the time I left school, I got a job and got an apprenticeship, and I don't know, life just flew by until I was about 19 or 20, and then in company with a close friend, I went overseas for about 18 months or so, and we did a little bit of hitchhiking, a bit of sightseeing, and a bit of work in other sort of occupations to just give us a bit of life experience, I suppose. Then we returned to Australia. My mate went back into his father's business, and I did a stint in the bush. I answered an advertisement to assist with some harvesting, but I ended up staying there about a year. And then eventually I left there, and actually the day I left there, I met Robin McAvoy, who I married not too long after that, and we had 2 children, Glenn and Donna. And a few years after that, the marriage didn't quite work, so we went separate ways, and I met a Scottish lass called Bernice Brodie, and we eventually got married and had another 2 children, William and Scotty. I was able to maintain a very close relationship with my 2 eldest children. We had them on the weekends. I started a small business at that time called Colour Offset Plate Making Service. It was to do with lithography, camera work, all that sort of stuff. And anyway, the business sailed along, and we had quite a few employees, and for a while, something that had been a bit of a hobby became a major part of my life, and that was I had been producing a small newsletter locally in the coastal suburbs of Marmion, Sorrento, Duncraig, Waterman's Bay, Trigg Island. And this was a little newsletter that was produced once a fortnight, delivered by a milkman, and every second Thursday. Well, eventually, when Bernice and I were married, we moved to Wanneroo. And I was telling Bernice about this thing. She became very interested, so we ended up going into partnership with another Wanneroo couple, and we started a small publication in Wanneroo, and we called it the Wanneroo Community News. That thing grew and grew, and after 10 years, it had become a major suburban newspaper chain in metropolitan Perth. Our very first issue, I think, had about 1,500 homes to deliver to. But by the time we left the business as owners, we were doing about 130,000 tabloid-sized newspapers once a week and under 4 different mastheads. So it had grown quite extensively. Still maintain contacts with that. I still write the occasional historic piece, and then I found the next thing that happened. I ended up on the Wanneroo Council, became the mayor, and after a while resigned from that and concentrated on a new business, which was self-storage, and we built that up over a few years, and now that employs William and Scott and my daughter's husband, Damien, who also acts as the main manager of the business. There was some message from my business with my son-in-law saying that somebody was trying to contact me, wanted to know if I was William Harold Edison Marwick. Of course, the family knows I am. Not too many other people know, and it's very, very rare that the Harold Edison part of the William Marwick ever gets a mention. So this was probably a little bit intriguing, but at that time, I didn't take a great deal of notice of it, but a few days later there was a message on my mobile phone, and that was checking to see if my name was William Harold Edison Marwick, and if my mother's maiden name was Elsie Jean Edison, and was my mother at one time married to a W.S. Marwick, which of course he was. It was William Sylvester Marwick. And the caller signed off as saying, if all this is true, then your mother is my grandmother. And that did get my attention. I was actually at Sir Charlie Gardner's hospital with waiting on my wife. Bernice had suffered from pancreatic cancer attack 2 years earlier and was undergoing some sort of treatment. And on that particular day, she was to get the results, if the cancer had come back. So I am sitting there with this message spinning around my head a bit and waiting. I didn't want to return the call to the caller. My first priority was just to know that my wife was okay. And then I had some very interesting news to tell her. Anyway, Bernice came out of the surgery all beaming and smiles and a happy girl, and I knew that everything was all right. So we decided to have a little cup of coffee together, and I said, I've got something that I would like you to listen to. And so after we were settled, we sat down and Bernice listened to this message on the phone. The caller introduced himself as John Glasson and then started to tell us all these connections. In fact, we were quite overwhelmed with the rapid delivery of all this unusually overwhelming news. And I'm still trying to fathom this out. Is this right or isn't it right? But it seemed pretty obvious to me it was, because I could almost picture the story. I mean, I knew my mother very well, and I could see that in all probability this would be a true story, and the story would have gone something like my mother would have fallen pregnant as a young girl, 16-year-old, had a baby possibly by the time she was 17 or just turned 17, 2 or 3 months. Baby obviously adopted out. Mother, before too long, possibly shunted off to Western Australia to stay with Auntie Elsie. And Auntie Elsie would best be described from my memory as something of a very strict dragon. And I pity my mother if she had to live with Auntie Elsie. I did get to meet her because although I didn't live with my mother when I was young, I did get to see her of a Sunday afternoon each week. Occasionally we would go and see Auntie Elsie, who was very odd indeed. She would place newspapers down, so this is on her polished floors, that we didn't disturb anything, and all the cutlery setting would have done justice to a first-class restaurant anywhere in the world. But she was an odd lady. Not one person you'd feel particularly comfortable with. Anyway, the odd thing I find about this is that my mother never mentioned this. I did find out in my own way that my mother lost my baby brother, and when I learnt that, I did go up to Kalgoorlie where he was buried and put a headstone on there and tidied the place up a bit. But I didn't know anything about anybody else, and to learn that I had a sister virtually all my life, not having known. And from what I've learnt of my sister, I think I could have probably been a bit useful in her life. I think I have a fairly protective nature, and the more I have learned from John about Mary Shirley, the more I just want to reach out and hug her. and sort of comfort her and understand and protect her. But that opportunity never came. But I have had the good fortune to meet John, because we communicated by emails a few times, and John advised that he was going to Cambodia, and I suggested that maybe if you'd like to pop in for 3 days and we could get together and have a bit of talk about all this. So the moment did come, John did come. I spent my life wondering about my Malwick side of the family, because my mother really didn't get on with her Malwick sisters-in-laws and so on. So kept pretty much apart from them over the years, and she rarely mentioned her Edison family. So I was more interested in the Malwicks, and I ended up coming to York and doing a lot of research, and then eventually writing a book about the Malwicks up here. Yeah, that went well. Little did I know that there was this probably a much bigger story in a way about the Edisons. There's always two sides to a family. It's not just your dad, not just your mum, but there are two sides. And for me, that's a good lesson, I think.
You know, she wasn't the typical grandmother or mother. She was like a little terrier. She had a fight in her. She just went charging on right through. Didn't matter what anyone said or did. She could destroy friendships. In her latter years, her memory was getting bad. I think we noticed the memory loss really when Pop died, because Pop had done everything for her, and we didn't realise to what extent that Elsa's memory was so bad. We used to take her out for lunch every Saturday, so we had to work in the morning, and I did love her. She was unusual, and you never know what she was going to do next. Pop was beautiful, and he did love her so much, and we all loved Pop for that. But also Pop was just a character on his own. As I'm sitting under Else, I believe she would be so pleased to know that after all this time, that in a funny sort of way, Bill and Mary Shirley have been united through you, John.
Well, I loved her very much as a child, but the older I got, the more I wasn't so enamoured with her. She had a lot of funny behaviours, but grandmothers and mothers are usually all about their children and grandchildren, whereas Nan was all about Nan. Nan, I remember her taking me to the movies, and I had a lovely little, I was 7, lovely little handbag. We went to Bones, and when we were in there, Nan's grabbing lollies out of the things and shoving them in my bag, and I'm terrified at 7 that I'm going to be arrested, and she's going, be quiet, say nothing, act normal. So another time we were at the movies, and Nan took her teeth out, and then we left, and Nan remembered her teeth, so we had to go back in while the next session was on, and it was just so embarrassing. And Nan insisted they turn the lights on, and everyone had to look for Nan's teeth, which they found, and then we were able to leave. So she'd have no qualms about stopping an entire cinema in the process. Oh, there were some really good things about Nan. I know she loved us. I know she did. But she was more, you know, like Pop, her husband, was beautiful, just beautiful. But where Nan had an entire wall of cupboard space, wardrobe filled with new dresses with price tags still on them, really expensive top designer. Pop had a few singlets and shorts and with holes in them in his little room. So Nan didn't really look out for anybody else. And I even remember later years asking for a cup of tea, and I'd she didn't even know where the cups were kept or the tea bags or anything, because Pop did everything for Nan. You know, there's some funny stories about Nan, but there's also the woman herself, you know, especially as I became a mother and started to understand what is involved in motherhood, I felt less and less comfortable about Nan and how she had treated my dad and really us. So, you know, I love her because she was my grandmother and I grew up loving her, but I don't respect the person she was.
Bill and wife Bernice live in the northern Perth suburb of Joondalup and have enjoyed many years serving the local community and leading an active social life with their family and friends. Bill divides his attention to their business interests, research and writing about Wanneroo and Joondalup's unique history, with the occasional newspaper article on the local district history, while Bernice actively supports a charity organisation for cancer research. Elsie Jean, my grandmother, died in never seeing her daughter Mary Shirley after relinquishing her for adoption in 1927. It is not known if Elsie had contact with her mother Comfort after Elsie moved to Western Australia. Comfort died in Carlton, Victoria in 1957. Her final resting place, an unmarked grave at Preston Cemetery, North Melbourne, and is buried with another person who we do not know. Perhaps Comfort did find happiness after she and Harold separated in 1918. When embarking on this journey, it was unknown what would be discovered about our ancestors' history, the lost relations found, and some secrets of the Peppercorn Tree revealed. I'm with my grandfather and his last resting place. I never knew him and never knew he existed. As I sit here at Grandpa's grave, I ponder the thoughts, what my mother went through when she was told so bluntly and callously that she was an illegitimate child. Mum was nobody's child. My mother never really had a life of happiness and joy. This has been an emotional journey for me, one of discoveries. I often wonder how things could have been different if my mother really knew the truth, that Grandpa was her father and not her brother, as she was raised to believe in her formative years until Grandma Bailey died. Francis William Bailey, the family story was that he was my mother's father. Now that we have the state board records and my mother's adoption records, we now know who her biological father was. Our grandfather, Leslie Bailey. From Cemetery Trust records, it was learnt that Joy was still living.
Pop came into our lives lives in approximately 1946 or 47, I'm just not quite sure what year it was. At that time, he was working at the Alaska Ice Cream Company, and we used to look forward to him coming home, especially weekends when he'd bring a great big tub of ice cream home. And then the thrill of having ice cream birthday cakes. In the first 6 months of knowing Pop, he used to bring his son Charlie to our place, and I used to have a lovely time because I didn't have a brother, and of course I fell in love with him. I thought he was just beautiful, and we were the same age. I was 3 months older. We got on really well. Well, then Charlie stopped coming, and it wasn't to ask the reason why. And back then we couldn't speak unless we were told to. So I don't really know what happened there, but I did miss him terribly. In 1949, Mum, Pop, and myself, we went across to Woodner. Now that's on the west coast of South Australia, and they managed hotels over there. And then about 1951, 52, they became relieving managers for the Ceduna Hotel and the Port Lincoln Hotel. I wasn't quite so keen, and I came back to Adelaide and lived with my grandmother. Back in 1953, they came back to Adelaide to live permanently, and Pop secured a job at the Royal Adelaide Showgrounds, which he absolutely loved because during the year he used to paint, and during showtime he was put in charge of the poultry section. And he loved poultry and showed a lot of his bantams and won many, many trophies. He also liked fishing, and he used to take the grandchildren down there fishing. And so he was a really good Pop to us. Mum and him, of course, had a few spats along the way. Pop did have rather a bad temper sometimes. Not to us kids, but Mum used to know how to get him going. I can tell you that. Yes, well, what did he used to do? My grandchildren loved him. They absolutely adored him. And he used to take them into the bathroom when he'd have a shave. And he'd give them a razor, and they'd stand up alongside of him and pretend to be shaving with him. Now, what year would we be? Yes, 56. Well, Pop actually, he started to be unwell. He had a heart problem which he didn't know about, and they thought that it was gallbladder trouble, but it turned out in the end it was blocked arteries. And there, of course, back in those days there wasn't a cure for, they hadn't perfected the heart operation, so we just had to sadly watch him get frailer and frailer as his heart just wouldn't function properly. And it was very sad. He passed away. He had his birthday on the Monday. On the Tuesday, the next day, he passed away. So that was a very sad day for all of us. I've got some pictures here taken with Pop and his first wife and his son Charlie. Beautiful photograph taken back in the 40s. very handsome family indeed. And then there's a picture of Pop with my mum and my youngest son Rodney. That was, Pop would have been 50 in this particular photograph. Mum continued to live on at Allenby Gardens after Pop passed away, and but it was never the same.
Leslie Bailey and his first wife Dorothy Edna only had one child, a son, Leslie Charles, another mystery of the Peppercorn Tree that Mary may have never known about. Dorothy Edna Bailey petitioned for divorce on the grounds of habitual cruelty. My grandfather never remarried. Leslie Charles Bailey had 4 children and died on the 1st of January 1980, resulting from a car accident at Hahndorf in the Adelaide Hills. Mary Shirley was a good mother who did the best she could through difficult circumstances. She loved her children and pined for them all to be reunited with her. Unfortunately, that opportunity never materialised.
We used to have a lot of fun in them short 4 years that I knew her. And I always used to wonder what happened to Mary. I used to say, and I always thought, and in actual fact, I think I used to say it to Mum. Mum never used to say anything about what happened to her, so, and until George's cousin, I think Vicky would have been second cousin or something, wouldn't she? Vicky would be. She contacted me, and then from there she was doing a family history. From then I met Mary's son John, and we've gone through a lot of documents together, which we concluded that the story that I was told was the story that had actually happened.
We all wondered certainly what happened to Mary, and she is a relation, and I think that Wally, had he lived, would have been very good for Mary Shirley. He would have made sure he found her and looked after her. But unfortunately Wally died in 1949 and Mary had left home by then. So perhaps in many ways Mary Shirley was fortunate to have known our Mary Jane Slater.
At the rear of the old home, now known as Mawson House and heritage listed, where her story evolved, there is an old, gentle peppercorn tree that stands sentinel, silently guarding many secrets from the past lives that it witnessed as Mary Shirley guarded her secrets. Mary Shirley suffered a fatal heart attack on the 7th of November 2001 at Adelaide, a broken heart and a cross of undeserved shame and guilt that her small, frail, aging body no longer carried the heavy burden.